Okay. Um, Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're watching from. Welcome to the Stop the War discussion on the different viruses that are sweeping the world, starting, of course, with COVID-19, but moving on to the others. Before I say anything more, I would like to apologize to you for the fact that Stop the War still exists. We would all love it to come to an end, but for that, wars have to end. And Stop the War has been going now since the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan after 9/11, and we have kept going because the wars don't end. And I hope that all those of you watching realize that keeping an organization like this going, of which Jeremy was one of the earlier chairpersons, and I've been involved with very actively in it too, requires funds and requires help. So if you feel so inclined, after the talk is over, please go to the Stop the War website, and even a modest donation will help. We're having very difficult times because of the virus and the lack of activity so far in this country. Well, it's interesting that the words spoken by George Floyd as he lay dying on a street in Minneapolis were, "I can't breathe." And for 9 minutes, the knee didn't come off his neck. Because what George said, of course, in his last moments, he didn't know, is something which also applies to other parts of the world. And it is ironic, if one can use that word, that one of the major symptoms of COVID is the lack of breathing. So people die because they can't breathe properly. George Floyd died because a policeman took the breath out of him by putting his neck on his knee. And parts of the world, Palestine and Kashmir in particular, can't breathe because of what Netanyahu and Modi are doing to the states in terms of the daily continuing repression. And then, of course, there is the virus of wars in the Middle East and parts of Africa, which are still continuing. So we have a rich discussion today with Jeremy Corbyn, whom you all know, former leader of the Labour Party, still extremely active and always will be active, we hope. And Arundhati Roy, the novelist, essayist, and activist who is in Delhi. So we're going to start with a few comments from Arundhati Roy, then Jeremy, and then we'll take up the discussion along the lines I've suggested. Arundhati, you're in Delhi, where the response to the virus has been absolutely abysmal. Could you give us an account of it?
Well, let me try. First of all, hello everybody, and thanks for watching. Let me try and do this briefly, because we're talking about the virus, of course, the virus of war and the virus. So I'll start first with the reaction of the Indian government to the COVID-19 virus. The first case was reported in India on the 30th of January. For 2 months, the government did nothing about the virus because it had other things to attend to. It had these massive protests, very much like the protests happening in America right now, against the anti-Muslim citizenship law, where young people across the board had come together. Women in city after city were sitting for weeks in protest. It culminated, of course, in an anti-Muslim pogromish situation in Northeast Delhi. That happened at a time when President Trump was visiting. And therefore, as the virus was spreading, when the logical thing to do would have been to shut down airports. Airports were open, people were coming. I think thousands of people came in from America for the Namaste Trump event that Modi had organized. And then even after the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic, nothing was done. But then the lockdown, when India had 545 cases and 10 deaths, Modi gave 1.38 billion people 4 hours notice and announced the most punitive lockdown in the world. And the whole world saw what happened in India. Millions of people, people who were like just one breath away, when we're talking about breaths, of being refugees, working class people were stranded in cities, and they began this spectacular long march home. So the lockdown really, what does it mean? Social distancing in the West, but in India it meant physical compression into slums, into buses, into trains, into migrant labor camps. And so 55 days, this country's economy was devastated and the virus continued to grow. And no other country in the world have we seen as this graph spikes sharply upwards. The lockdown has ended. And so you have double devastation. We were hammered both ways, by the lockdown, by the economic devastation, and now by this virus that's spreading. And of course, you know, in India, you have other illnesses like tuberculosis, where in this period where 6,000 people have died of COVID, 150,000 would have died of tuberculosis alone. So that's one part of the virus. And the other, Tariq, since you mentioned Kashmir, today marks 10 months of Kashmir under lockdown. I mean, the world may be able to understand better now that when the lockdown was first announced, they had no notice, except that there was a massive round of arrests. And then they were locked down for months without phone, without internet. Surely a crime, a massive mass human rights violation. And lockdowns have begun and ended, but there's been even now there's no proper internet there. So Kashmiris have been economically crushed. And while we are there, when we're talking about imperialism, of course now American imperialism is facing a challenge from China. And having abrogated the special status of Kashmir enshrined in the Indian Constitution on the 5th of August, India has basically changed the status quo in the whole region. And now China is threatening India at its borders, has occupied territory in Ladakh. And of course, India cannot respond to China in the way it responds to Pakistan. And therefore, having abrogated and sort of dissolved the status quo itself, finds itself in an extremely awkward position where the new rising power of China is breathing down India's neck, and I don't think it knows what to do.
Thanks. Jeremy, what would have been different had we had a Labour government in power in Britain in terms, just to start off with, of dealing with the virus?
Thanks, Tariq. And can I just say, first of all, thank you to everyone for joining this call today, and thank you to you for hosting, and Arundhati for being a part of this wonderful discussion. And I think we should just reflect for one moment the value of having a call like this. I've been looking at the people on the call today, and they're from all over the world. And the one thing that Corona crisis has taught us is that it's quite possible to communicate very quickly with each other and have some better understanding of the rest of the world. And we don't necessarily have to go to a meeting place to do it. So can that be a lesson for all of us, that when we do resume our more normal activities, we always make space for those that can come online. And so we build up a real sense of international understanding as a result of that. And I was very impressed with an article that Arundhati wrote recently, in which he described the difference in India between the flying classes and the walking classes, where the flying classes got brought home by the Indian government and the walking classes sadly had to walk huge distances to go back home from where they had been contract workers, and some died because the only safe place to walk was on a railway track where many were killed. That is an indication of just how unequal the society is. And before I just deal with your point, Tariq, I just say this, that the global pandemic of COVID has exposed the inequality in the health systems around the world, the inequality within societies, the disproportionate death rate of black communities compared to others in the USA and other places, and the way in which Trump and the medical insurance lobby in the United States have attacked the World Health Organization is very, very serious indeed. The World Health Organization's fundamental principle is that everyone should have access to universal health care, something that I passionately support and believe in. And how the world is framed post-COVID is going to be very important. Are we going to go down the road of austerity, poverty, privatization, and more sort of global IMF style of bailouts to national economies with all the inequality that follows, or are we going to do something very different? I hope fervently it's something very different, and I do believe the mobilization of people around the world on this at a community level has huge political ramifications for the future on environment and many other issues. Now, when the World Health Organization announced that they had discovered this virus in Wuhan province, there are reports that initially the regional authorities in Wuhan tried to suppress news of it, but eventually it did come out quite quickly, I suspect. And the WHO sent out a world warning, sent out a view that it was an epidemic, and then very quickly became a pandemic, and asked everyone to test, locate and isolate where necessary in order to prevent the spread of it. Countries that did that did it very effectively. Unfortunately, in Britain, we had a process where for a while the Prime Minister was following a belief that somehow or other we would develop a herd immunity to it. In other words, a number of people would get the virus and recover from it or not, as the case may be, and gradually a herd immunity would develop. Well, it's a method often used in breeding of farm animals and cattle and so forth, but it actually has its origins in eugenic theories. It is a nonsense. It's dangerous, and it did delay the response in Britain. Eventually, the government did get onto it, but then discovered that because of woeful planning, there was a shortage of personal protective equipment, there was a shortage of hospital beds, 94% occupancy because of 10 years of austerity and cuts, and so we were ill prepared for it. If we get through all this thing, which obviously we will, it's going to be thanks to the cleaners in hospitals, many of whom are migrant workers. It's going to be thanks to all those low-paid people that work in care and NHS facilities in Britain. And as I pointed out in the last Prime Minister's question time I did in March was, who's more valuable at the present time? A cleaner in a hospital or a hedge fund manager that's speculating against the future of our public services? And so my view is that the British government was too slow to respond, and it's exposed all the inequalities. And now the debate moves on to future funding of the NHS, but also an investment-led or austerity, investment-led economy or austerity of the future. I'll finish on this, Tariq, because I know we want to go into questions and discussion, but there are big issues facing the world. You and I were there when we founded Stop the War Coalition in 2001. We were astonished at the number of people that turned up. We were expecting a few hundred, and thousands turned up, and thousands continued to turn up, and we organized meetings, marches and rallies. Like you, I wish Stop the War didn't have to exist, but it does. And here we are all these years later. And the derivation of those wars has been the refugee flows of the Middle East, has been the wars all across the Middle East, has been the refugee camps in Libya, in Lebanon, and so on. There's also the virus of racism around the world, which the murder of George Floyd is an example, but there are other people that are murdered around the world, essentially xenophobic or racist lines in many, many societies. Maybe because of the huge concentration on media when many people are locked down at home, there is going to be a mobilization that will ensure that we have a better and brighter future. And the last thing I'd say is this: the environmental crisis facing this world has been exposed. One of the side effects of corona has been that for the first time in many big cities, people have breathed clean air. Arundhati will no doubt tell us that the air in Delhi suddenly got a lot better when many of the polluting vehicles were not allowed to use the roads. And the same story has happened in many cities all around the world. And so it does show we could do things differently. So are we to go back to polluting industries, or are we going to give people the confidence that environmental sustainability does mean investment in clean green energy, does mean investment for the future, and is actually a better prospect for the future for the entire world, rather than returning to polluting and dangerous industries? So I think this is a moment of the most enormous opportunity, and I'm very, very optimistic, very, very optimistic that post-corona, there's going to be that sense of world solidarity, which started to grow on many occasions in history, grew massively in 2003 when we had 600 demonstrations around the world against the Iraq War. We didn't stop the Iraq War, obviously, but everyone that was there remembers those moments. Everyone that was there remembers those moments and are empowered by it. Those that will remember this corona crisis and the racism crisis in the USA and other places are empowered by it and will remember that moment. So I'm very optimistic for the future.
If we just come to this point, which you stress now, and Arundhati has written about, I've spoken about numerous times, what is going to happen after we return to some semblance of normality and the virus, COVID virus, has been crushed. I'm less optimistic than you for the following reasons, Jeremy. I hope you're right, by the way. But I think after the 2008 Wall Street crash, which absolutely shook capitalism to its core, people thought, including bankers, including columnists in the Financial Times, etc., that some structural reform was necessary to stop this happening again. And there was some hope that given the response to this crash, people, losing jobs, factories collapsing, massive rise in unemployment, the ideological arguments in favor of neoliberalism completely crashed, something would happen. Well, it didn't, as we know. None of the governments in power anywhere in Western Europe or the United States. I mean, bankers in Wall Street were shocked. When they went to see Obama, they thought they'd be ticked off for being naughty. Instead, if it was wine and canapes all around and how are we going to get through this, they were really shocked, as they wrote about. So nothing happened. Now, after the virus is over, the governments, most of the governments will bank on short memories, especially in the West. And I think we'll probably try and carry on business as usual and hope that the next virus will be long delayed, unless we have some mass movements, unless there's continuous opposition. And parliamentary opposition there might be on a limited scale, but that is not going to stop all the pro-capitalist governments that are in power today. And it's not going to push even the Democratic, Joe Biden, the Democratic Party nominee in the United States, into creating a proper health service there. So I'd like Arundhati first and then you to just talk about this on what we can do after normality is restored, but what governments and the powers that be will do after it's restored. Arundhati.
Speaking from here, Tariq, I don't think normality can be restored because the devastation that has happened, the economic devastation that has taken place, the 115 million people have lost jobs. As I said, there was this whole exodus from cities to villages that were devastated in the first place by neoliberalism. People were forced to flee their villages into cities. Now they've gone back. Of course, they'll have to come back because there's nothing in the villages, you know. And already you're seeing the government doing two things. One is ratcheting up the ideas of privatization of natural resources. You know, there was the threat of an elephant sanctuary in Assam being made into a coal mine, big dams, all of that. The privatization of everything. The privatization and the onlineization of education that is going to leave millions of underprivileged Dalit children, Adivasi children out of the education system. The privatization that was on the cards before this happened, you know. So this online thing where you have a very, I mean, you don't have that many people who have access to online, to smartphones and so on, but the rest of the world is racing ahead, you know, with it, leaving people behind. But the other really terrifying thing is that, as I said, we've taken a double hit. And now what's happening is, you can see it now, that the government is trying to change the narrative to make people forget about the economy, to make people forget about Corona, which is out of control here now, by ratcheting up its old Hindu nationalist, anti-Muslim rhetoric, by arresting students, by arresting activists, by preaching the most horrific, vicious, you know, bile on the mainstream media that it controls. So you know, they're going to sell us this hatred, pit people against each other more than they already have, to sell a story to a devastated nation. And you know that Modi can sell anything because he is so adored by this particularly powerful middle class and the media. So as they say, he can sell a comb to a bald person, you know, and all of us who buy it will be stupidly combing our bald heads, while this kind of hubris of control, the kind of fear in the business community, in the media, in every day you wake up wondering who's going to be the next person arrested. You know, there was an anti-Muslim pogrom. The police smashed the Jamia Millia Islamia library. They made war against the students in Aligarh Muslim University with stun grenades, which you use in anti-terrorist operations. But the people being arrested are all mostly young Muslim students or left activists. And the narrative of us all being anti-India and anti-national and pro-terrorist is being spewed from the 400 24/7 news channels we have here. So the situation at the moment is pretty terrifying in terms of how we are going to have COVID and the economic breakdown stuffed down our throats, the 10-month blockade and the destruction of life in Kashmir, you know, which nobody is talking about anymore. I mean, everybody's so broken by what happened to them in the lockdown while they were exchanging, WhatsApp messages and making Zoom calls with each other. Think of the Kashmiris locked down with nothing, no communication, no medical care, an army outside, concertina wire outside, and we call ourselves a democracy, and we are supposed to celebrate this that is happening. And perhaps for saying this now, you know, you'll be called all kinds of names, or perhaps things will happen. You know, this is, and for someone like me, so you can imagine the rest of the people who don't even have the protection of being sort of reasonably well known. The prisons are full of lawyers, activists, students, human rights people, and of course, you know, people in their 70s are being arrested, shoved into jail where COVID is such a real threat.
Can I just ask you a quick follow-up?
Yes.
The picture you paint is, of course, very depressing, and you're right. I think you're right. But is there no opposition at all in India within official politics, or bourgeois politics, as we used to call it?
It's interesting. It's a very interesting question you ask, Tariq, because, of course, you know, there have been, you know, places like Kerala where the crisis has been managed better than in other places. But really the only politician who's openly attacking Modi is Rahul Gandhi, and he doesn't really have much support, but he's doing it. Everyone else, whether they are state level parties or they're just in complete disarray, one doesn't know why. You know, one thing is that all of them have some sorts of cases against them, and they are, you know, one by one have been cornered into kind of keeping quiet or facing you know, legal action for various things. I don't know what the reason is, but all I know is whether it's the politicians, whether it's the bureaucrats, whether it's at the state level or at the center, whether it's industrialists, everyone's brains are frozen in a kind of fear because the minute someone speaks out, they get attacked viciously. I mean, being trolled and threatened and all that is just one part of it. But the attack is merciless. So there's so much fear.
Jeremy, what do you think is going to happen here after we return to normality and the government more or less carries on as before? I mean, and also given the changes in the Labour Party, whether that party is going to protest as it would have had you been a leader. I mean, surely trade union actions, mobilizations against any further privatizations of the health service, etc., are absolutely necessary.
I think there's been a big lesson that has been learned all around the world by people who were perhaps previously skeptical of the point of view that you and I might share about the role of public services in dealing with people's problems and crises, and that is that we now have had a huge amount of public spending in order to maintain jobs and maintain services, whilst there's been obviously a big downturn in taxation income. Only 6 months ago, in the general election, I was absolutely lambasted by every single one of our national newspapers, with the exception of the Morning Star, for wanting to spend too much money, and it was unaffordable, the programme was unachievable, and a fully funded NHS, fully funded education, access to broadband for everybody, in public ownership of some of our key utilities, not even all of them, so key utilities, was absolutely impossible to achieve. Every single media outlet attacked my party and me for what I put forward. And 2 months later, Corona crisis comes along. We had a meeting with the Prime Minister, myself and a number of colleagues, and we put it to him that the government would have to intervene to protect jobs, would have to intervene to defend services, and would have to provide a job support package. John McDonnell pushed really, really hard on that, and eventually we got the furlough scheme and 80% of wages being paid for people who were laid off because of the corona crisis. And all the way along the line, it's been pressure that helped to bring that about. It's not a complete answer to everything, but it was a step forward. Now, at the end of this crisis, are people going to say, okay, it's all right now, I'll lose my job, I'll go on, in the case of Britain, to universal credit, and I'll wait 5 weeks to get a payment for it, and I'll hopefully something will pick up in the future? Or are we to say, no, this is the time to invest in the future, an investment-led economy that brings about that more equal society and more sustainable future? There are people on this call from pretty well every country, all around the world. Hundreds of people on this call, thousands. And they're all going through a broadly similar experience, where Corona has led to a lockdown, Corona has led to job reductions, job losses, and exposed the inequalities in society. Are people just going to meekly accept that we go back to business as usual? I don't think so. I really don't think so. But change doesn't happen unless people do something about it. And so that does mean education, it does mean challenging the power of the media, and it does mean using the technology that's available, which we are using today, in order to mobilize and speak to each other. Now, Stop the War hosted this call, and I thank them for that. And I think we should just remember that at the start of the Corona crisis in January, Antonio Guterres, the General Secretary of the United Nations, called for a ceasefire in all conflicts in order to deal with the Corona crisis. Well done him for doing that. Yet the arms still flow to Saudi Arabia that have been used to bomb the people of Yemen. The war carries on in Yemen. The refugee crisis of the Rohingya people moving into camps in Cox's Bazar continues. The refugee crisis in Libya and Lebanon continues, and others do. And so we do need a global movement that recognizes the real threat to world security is health and poverty inequality. The real threat to global security are wars based on the abuse of human rights and the thirst for grabbing somebody else's resources. The real threat to our security is actually the environmental crisis. That is how we should be facing the future.
Thank you, Jeremy. The other question, which of course arises, what I said at the beginning of the discussion, is and Arundhati has spoken very eloquently, as she always does, about Kashmir, and the fact that this occupied province, occupied by Indian troops under every single government that has existed in India, the situation has got completely out of control, where there are concentration camps, where just 4 days ago, 11 Kashmiris' deaths who died were not even considered important enough to report in most of the global press. But I would now like to come to another part of the world, which ironically links the knee on the neck of George Floyd to this region, because a lot of the American police forces have been trained in Israel, not just the Americans, also many from right-wing countries in South America. And the methods of dealing with protests, or even with ordinary citizens, is virtually the same. You can find lots of photographs of Israelis when people are brave enough to take photographs with their knees on the neck of Palestinians. And this is another subject which has virtually been downgraded compared to even 5-6 years ago. Because people have got frightened by this campaign, which alleges that everyone is anti-Semitic except those who support Israel. That basically was the campaign waged by Israeli embassies everywhere, of which one of the central targets was Jeremy Corbyn. But this has been waged in many, many other parts of the world. Interestingly, the Americans are resisting it. Young Americans of Jewish origin are resisting it better than almost any other country in the world, and especially Europe. And like the Kashmiris, the Palestinians are being ignored by the Arab governments, by the people who rule these countries, though there is a lot of sympathy for the Palestinians amongst ordinary Egyptians, ordinary people who live in other parts of the Arab world. The Palestinians, let's not beat about the bush, have suffered a huge defeat. It's not even a secret. Their own leaders, who are partially responsible for the defeat, have admitted so, saying we've been screwed. and an occupation is underway, which is going to end what has existed, these little remnants, these Bantustans that have existed in Palestine. As Netanyahu says, he's determined basically to take over the whole region with the Western world watching. And you know, it's so upsetting and makes one really angry that there's little we can do at the moment. I mean, Europe is a continent without a conscience, either on Palestine or Kashmir or the refugees who they pay the Turks off billions to keep there in appalling conditions. The United States on Israel, again, is marginally better than many European countries. There's more criticism, there's more flow. What are we going to do about Palestine? Jeremy.
Well, I have been 9 times to Israel and Palestine in my life, and I had a very interesting Zoom discussion with human rights and peace groups in Israel with people in Palestine a couple of weeks ago. And they were all agreed on the dangers of the Trump plan. The Trump plan is, as you know, to occupy an enormous swathe of the West Bank, to break up the continuity of any Palestinian managed territory on the West Bank, the continual separation from Gaza, and as you quite rightly put it, essentially a series of Bantustans would be established all over the West Bank. Now, the opposition to the plan is huge. There's global opposition to it, and in Trump's greatly weakened position at the present time, maybe he'll be concentrating on other things, but I wouldn't be so confident about that. The danger isn't so much that the plan will go through. I don't think in its current form it would, but that there will be some tinkering around of it a bit, and it will somehow or other be presented as a victory, when in reality, the Trump plan is a continuation of the strategy that's been adopted against Palestine for a very long time, which is one of division and isolation. And so I do think there has to be a great statement of solidarity that to bring about any kind of long-term peace, you have to end the occupation, end the settlement strategy, and allow the Palestinian people the freedom to travel, which they're denied at the present time, and to end the siege of Gaza, which is awful in what it says. Now, Netanyahu himself is greatly weakened because he's going to be partly occupied with appearances in court rather than just being the co-prime minister. And there are some forces in Israel that are opposed to the Trump plan that see the dangers of it. But it has been knocked off the headlines by the corona crisis. And I think we need to put the situation back on the headlines, because if we don't, then what Trump wants and what presumably Netanyahu wants on his behalf is the same thing, which is the destruction of the principle of a place that you can call Palestine, and instead essentially Israeli occupation of the whole of that territory. That won't bring peace, it won't bring concord, it will actually bring a greater sense of insecurity to everyone within the region. And so you cannot keep on denying a people their voice and then not pay a price for it. And so I say that as somebody that wants to live in a world of peace and wants to live in a world free from racism. And you mentioned at the start of your comments, Tariq, anti-Semitism. Let's just get it clear. Anti-Semitism is evil, it is wrong, it can never be condoned under any circumstances. And I never would, you never would, Arundhati never would in any way. And we have to all be united against any form of racism of any sort. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, the racism that's current in the USA following the murder of our friend in Minnesota.
I agree. And we have to be equally tough sometimes when the charge of anti-Semitism is used to stop us speaking about Palestine. That's very important. Arundhati, you have over the years written about Palestine and spoken about Palestine. And if my information is correct, you're a supporter of BDS, the only non-violent campaign started by the Palestinians that is also being denounced as anti-Semitic. What do you think of what is going on there?
Well, I think that, that conflict in Palestine radiates out and has created such a crisis in the whole world. It isn't just Palestine and Israel, but the anger just radiates out. And equally now we have a situation where almost all the lessons that have been taught by Israel in the occupation of the Gaza and West Bank are being played out in Kashmir. You have a new domicile policy. You have really on the cards a situation where Kashmir and the Kashmiri identity will sort of cease to exist. And that you are dealing with two neighbors, both of whom are nuclear powers. You have China falling into the mix now. So for us to think that this is all just some local problem is ridiculous, and it's like just putting some sort of gasoline into the fault lines and keeping matches very close by. I think obviously, from the time of partition, from the whole anger and despair and horror of what people have been through in this subcontinent, which hasn't been dealt with, which has been sort of sought to be papered over. All of that is now rising to the surface. And unless all of us have a way of thinking, even if it's an idealistic way, we have to have some ideals towards which all our various local arguments, our local protests and all of that are geared towards what is it that we're fighting for? What kind of world is it that we want? How is it possible for people in India who belong to the left or who belong to other organizations that are so very, very alert to injustices being done to them can support the horror that is unfolding in a place like Kashmir and just hold it in your abdomen? You can't. It turns corrosive at some point. And the same thing applies to what is happening in Palestine, I think. So I think when you're talking about the knee on the neck, there is that knee on many necks, and all the necks and all the knees are connected in some way, and we have to understand it even as we are very local in our protests and very local and very detailed in our understanding, whether it's environmental issues or whatever it is, but surely these necks and knees are connected.
I remember that your remark now reminds me of what the very great Palestinian writer, spokesperson, activist Ghassan Kanafani said once in the 70s. He was killed and shot dead by the Israelis. And Kanafani said, when asked, why is your organization, he was a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation, is opposed to talking to the Israeli government at the moment. And Kanafani replied, it is very difficult for the neck to enter into discussions with the sword.
Yes.
Which I have to say, when you look at what's happening on Palestine every single day. Anyway, let's move on to, before I put some questions to you from our listeners, let's just discuss for a few minutes at least what is happening in the United States. That it's black people have been killed by cops in the United States for, a long, long time. The Ku Klux Klan was, it's worth remembering, the largest political movement to ever exist in the United States, which infiltrated the police, it infiltrated the political parties and everywhere for a long, long time.
Like the RSS now in India.
Exactly like the RSS in India, very similar. And so what we are watching isn't, is horrific, but it's not surprising. I mean, the attacks on black people in the United States from slavery onwards, with a limited gap after the Civil War, have carried on, and white supremacists have always been strong. Trump is now quite open, and his supporters even more open on this question. But it's clearly something that triggered off the video of George Floyd being killed. It's the sight of it, that this is still happening despite everything, still happening despite the Obama period, when lots of people were saying we're now in a post-racial America. Big joke that is. And we're now witnessing what we are, which is quite remarkable because it didn't happen after Ferguson on this scale. It's in virtually every state of the United States of America. And to think the American president is asking for troops to come and protect the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. I mean, thinking even of martial law, which has created havoc in the Pentagon. I mean, 2 defense secretaries have attacked this. Pentagon generals have said, we don't like the army being used. I'm not surprised, because there are large numbers of black people inside the American army, so they're nervous. I mean, what are you trying to do, divide the army? But we have now a problem that, on the one hand, all of us are in favor of observing not that America is applying them, but else generally we are people observing the rules, distancing, keeping safe. And yet, in a movement of spontaneity, hundreds of thousands of Americans have just come out onto the streets, black and white. The solidarity is very, very striking and moving in this movement. And then there have been demos in London, in Paris, in Berlin, a huge one in Amsterdam on this issue. So where is this movement going to go, if anywhere, Arundhati?
Well, I think, I've watched that video so many times, and the theater of it is so chilling, because that man is kneeling on George Floyd's neck with his hand in his pocket, and there are people watching, and he's literally daring them. And he's being protected by his officers. One of them is an Asian. And when you look at what's happening, I mean, since the advent of slavery and since slavery ended, the American establishment has used so many ways in which to reincarcerate, disenfranchise, and somehow hobble the African American community. There is a sort of latent fear, and how do you hobble them while appearing to be democratic and constitutional? This has been something that has, of course, gone on. It's a societal thing more than a Democrat versus Republican thing. And here, obviously, you see similar kinds of theatrical lynchings of Muslims happening. But what happens, I think, is that that rage that is spilling out is because Trump himself, almost secretly in his speeches, is signaling to white supremacists he wants the polarization. Every time he does something or says something or insults someone who's Chinese or someone who's black, while some people rally to their support, his base is consolidating. So he's a politician who is, I don't think he's doing this stupidly or innocently. It's almost like he's signaling to his people something. He's saying something in those coded tweets of his. It's the same over here, that every time you lynch a Muslim, every time a vigilante mob lynches a Muslim, they put it up on YouTube. And for all the people that are horrified, you have the consolidation of the Hindu right-wing upper caste group, and this is a political constituency. So the narrative is being built on the other side, you know, and that's why I think the people who are raging on the streets now are raging against everything that has been done to them by the Trump regime, including, you know, the knee on the neck and the theatrical killing of George Floyd. But you know, they are raging against what coronavirus has exposed, the kind of the lack of medical attention historically to the Black community, which is why they are dying in such great numbers, you know, because they have not had access to medical care, and therefore their bodies are vulnerable to this virus, whereas other bodies might be more protected, and then when they get it, they are treated worse. So the explosion cannot be just about one thing, you know. It's an explosion against an establishment that is trying to polarize people, and this is a manifestation of that polarization. I don't know how it will be resolved. I feel so worried because, you know, we've all seen the Arab Spring. We've seen how those spontaneous explosions of anger were quickly managed, and the situation was made even worse. The same thing happened in India with the anti-citizenship law amendment protests. How quickly the narrative has been recast and the hatreds have been kind of amplified by for example, here, blaming Muslims for spreading coronavirus, calling them human bombs, hashtag Corona Jihad. All of this is a way of diffusing those anti-citizenship law protests. So in the same way, the American establishment will work very, very hard to diffuse any revolutionary dimension to these protests. They will let the anger come out, and then they will direct it towards, you know, vote for the other guy and keep the status quo.
Yeah, the other guy, of course, is one of his statements was an appeal to the police not to aim at the heart of the blacks, but to aim for their legs. So disable them, don't kill them. Jeremy, your views?
Could just ask through you, Tariq, Arundhati, how much unity has there been across both Muslim and Hindu young people, and for that matter, Sikh young people in India on the citizenship law? Or has it served what its initial purpose probably was, in order to further divide people?
Well, when the protest emerged, it was one of the most beautiful, poetic displays of solidarity between Sikhs, between young Hindus, between young Muslims. But when, so the Delhi elections happened when this protest was at its peak, when the women were sitting in Shaheen Bagh in Delhi. They had been sitting there for months, refusing to go home. And the BJP campaign was that these are jihadis, these are Pakistani, these are anti-nationals. And BJP politicians came out saying, Desh ke gaddaron ko goli maro salon ko, which means shoot down the traitors. Now, the politicians that actually came out and were saying these things still remain highly visible, still remain seated at the side of ministers who are, you know, announcing this meager compensation for COVID victims. But this whole episode of the Tablighi Jamaat that met in Nizamuddin, quite near my house, before the lockdown, and then were locked into Nizamuddin during the lockdown and turned out to be super spreaders. But now we're being blamed for purposely doing Corona Jihad, for spreading the disease, and the fear of the disease, the fear of the epidemic has created an atmosphere in which Muslims are being associated with corona somehow in the way that the Nazis used to associate Jews with the spreading of typhus. So a lot of the solidarities that were formed have been diffused pretty successfully with this media campaign. And one doesn't know whether it will reassemble, but in order to prevent it from reassembling, people are being arrested. Left leaders, young students, Muslims are being arrested every day and thrown into prison, accused of plotting the Northeast Delhi anti-Muslim massacre. Muslims are being arrested for that, you know, so the bizarreness is out of control. But it's a very, very dangerous situation right now. But yes, there's a lot of mobilization and solidarity and a lot of anger too, although it can't be expressed because everybody is now terrified of this virus, which is on the loose. The lockdown has ended, but you know, the numbers are spiking. So there's a lot of fear, and into that fear, this hatred is being re-injected.
Thanks. On the US question that you raised, Tariq, and I was very grateful for Arundhati for describing the situation in India just now. That's really good. In the US, I kind of wonder if Trump's extreme statements over the last few days are not actually a totally cynical, calculated way in which he will mobilize his own base and then slightly modify his message in a couple of months' time and hope that somehow or other he can get re-elected in November on this. Because what I do observe in the USA is a sense of anger about the killing of George Floyd, a sense of anger about the wholly disproportionate number of Black people that have died in New York, in Chicago, in California, all across the USA because of corona crisis. And whilst there are some people trying to give some medical reason for this, I think the overwhelming issue has to be addressed, and that is the levels of poverty, of inequality, of lack of access to healthcare, of poor quality food, of limited life expectancy, etc., which underline all the inequalities within the USA. And whilst they're very extreme in the USA, they exist in other countries as well, including my own here in Britain. And so it is interesting as to how it's going to develop in the USA, but it also means that those opposed to Trump have got to be very serious in putting forward an alternative, and that is why the messages from Bernie Sanders and Alexandra AOC on Green New Deal, on greater equality, on universal health care are so very, very important. They do provide an alternative, and they do provide an alternative to the way the USA will behave towards the rest of the world. But I think we shouldn't be too complacent about this. It's not automatic that at the end of the corona crisis, everyone is going to come together and demand everything that we on this call generally want and believe in. It does have to be campaigned for and fought for. And that's why the point I was making earlier about the media and education are very important, and the understanding of history as well. I noticed on the strap line coming across, and there are some wonderful comments coming across there. Somebody said, well, on this occasion, we should read the works of Frantz Fanon. They're right. There are many other people's works one should read, but in particular, I think that message about an understanding of global history and that our inequalities come from that understanding of history is a way that we can go forward together. And so it is about mobilizing people and the actions that go with it and getting that unity message across. And in the USA, I hope I don't know if there's any callers on from the USA because it must be quite early in the morning there, that it would be interesting to hear what their perception is on the degree of unity on the streets of all communities in support and solidarity with the Black community in the Black Lives Matter campaign. Certainly in this country, there's been a massive response and massive support for Black Lives Matter, whereas a few months ago, many people wouldn't really have understood what the concept of the campaign Black Lives Matter was about. They certainly do now.
One
Jeremy,
thing I
ask?
from the...
I just wanted to ask Jeremy something.
Yeah.
Which is that, you know, it's interesting that since he's a politician, it's interesting that while the corona crisis was uncoiling in America, you had one Democratic politician who was speaking about healthcare for all. And all the people that supported him, AOC, the Democratic Party basically didn't want him there, you know, and still doesn't want him there. So how does one look at this really cozy little party that electoral politics has become? I mean, I'm not saying that people should not vote, they should vote, but vote for the enemy they want to have, you know, like vote Trump out, yes. But isn't it amazing how this nexus between finance and politicians have created a system where the exits have been sealed off. So anybody who's talking sense isn't even considered an outlier for this.
Thanks for that. I've got some experience of the nexus of finance and media coming together to attack people for what are actually eminently sensible, very moderate, reasonable ideas. All I was saying in the election was that every child matters in every school and should be properly funded. Everybody's health matters and should be properly funded. And everybody's right to somewhere to live matters, and there should be houses built to achieve it. And that the very biggest corporations should pay their tax. Anyway, this was seen as such a devastating attack on the whole system that the whole lot opened up on the Labour Party, me and supporters. And I'm very well aware of the very cozy relationship that develops in all parliaments, in all parties around the world, between the richest and most powerful, most influential people in the media and in big business. And the only way you can overcome that is mass movements outside. And I spent 5 years as leader of the party, trying to build the party, build the base, and build that sense of understanding. And we became the largest political party in Europe as a result of it. There's 600,000 members when I stepped down as leader of the party. We lost the election, I know, obviously, mainly because of perceptions about Brexit, but also because of the attacks on us. But interestingly, every single one of the individual policies we put forward, public ownership of mail, rail, water, national education service, fully funded, publicly owned and run national health service, access to internet, the green industrial revolution, every one of those, when opinion polled, had an overwhelming majority in support. It was the attempt at the destruction of those that were speaking out on this compendium of issues that was successful. And so unless we challenge the power of monopoly control of so much of our information and media, then it's always going to be hard to get that message across. Now, it can be done by what we're doing today, and it can be done by lots of other means, but you don't do it by sitting at home and shouting at the TV screen. It doesn't do you any good. It damages your throat.
Great. We have to move now to questions from viewers. Actually, looking down at them, most of what has been said today answers the questions which I've got, except on one thing. And what we haven't talked about, and what questioner, Lawrence, no, is it Lawrence? It's a question for all the panel. Oh, right, okay. Do you think that there might be a war between the United States and China, and what explains why Trump's aggression towards the Chinese at this particular moment. Let's keep this brief so we can try and get in one or two other questions. Arundhati.
There might be some sort of proxy wars. I don't think there'll be a direct conflict, but like I said, you know, India has aligned itself with Trump, and Modi and Trump are great friends, and there is trouble on the borders, which I think they're trying to settle, but it's a very uneasy situation. Nepal is also involved in it. So these conflicts will not be direct, but they will be proxy conflicts. But one of the reasons for Trump's aggression is that I think before the George Floyd thing happened, there was definitely a plan to fight the elections using China as the demon, just like India would use Pakistan in its election campaigns, you know. So there was definitely the hope of trying to have some incidents, to create a monster, to lay the blame on someone, to parade yourself as a hero. These huge, massive protests because of the death of George Floyd might have sort of destabilized that path. But yeah, that's what I think.
Jeremy?
I think there is a danger of a military conflict between the USA and China, and it could be sparked off by South China Sea naval maneuvers. It could be sparked off by issues surrounding North Korea, or it could be that we begin to understand the pressures on this come from the Asia-Pacific strategy, which the Obama government started, and that China has developed a much greater military capacity. But surely to goodness, there has to be a realization that a growing militarization between the US and China is dangerous, is utterly disastrous, and one really asks the question why the USA feels it necessary to build up this massive military presence on the sea just off the coast of China. For what purpose is it? Because if they're worried about Chinese economic power around the world, which is considerable, huge and growing, then they should also ask themselves the question, why are so many American companies investing in China? And China itself has a huge leverage, which I think I'm right in saying, I'm sure there'll be somebody on the call incorrect if I'm wrong, has the largest dollar reserves of any government anywhere in the world. And so the dangers are huge, and the dangers of a trade war morphing into a hot war are also huge. And so anyone who wants to read the history of where trade wars lead to, read the history of the collapse of empires into war in 1914, which was in part about commercial interests around the world. And so that does mean we've got to be very well aware of this. We've got to oppose the militarization. And the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference was postponed from April, May time of this year till next year. That gives us an opportunity to say, well, the real issues of security around the world are environmental, are of food supply, are of health equality, and are about the sustainability of the entire planet. COVID has awakened people's minds. Let's keep them alive.
Okay, I think a hot war, a direct war between China and the United States, of course one can't rule out anything, would create such havoc all over. It'll be a global catastrophe. And the regions through which the United States normally has tried to intervene in China have been Taiwan and to a certain degree Hong Kong as well. But I don't think they're going to get support for wars. I mean, these are nuclear states. The Chinese army is largely defensive and effectively defensive. So if any attempt is made to start a direct war, I think the Americans will be in for a surprise. What we are seeing is, as Jeremy said, big trade clashes because of the Chinese economic developments that have taken place. They want to stop that. They fear it. They're trying to get the other European states to gang up. Britain is first behind them. Some of the statements that have been made. We'll see what the Germans do. And the hostility to China has arisen, not because of the trade exclusively, but also because China has taken its own positions on global issues. It didn't support the most of the wars that the United States has recently started. It has its own position. It's opposed to sanctions against Iran and Venezuela. And this assertion of Chinese sovereignty is angering the United States, which was used to Russia and China just backing them up for quite some time after the 90s. That is now stopped happening. Thanks to everyone who has listened. Thanks to Arundhati and Jeremy for being with us. Thanks to all of you listening abroad. And it'd be great if some of you actually joined. Even if you're in other parts of Europe, there's no Stop the War in your countries. Stop the War is a unique organization. We created, all of us collectively, in Britain, after 9/11 and after the war against Afghanistan. And it needs help and it needs you to join. So being a European doesn't mean, and despite Brexit, doesn't mean you can't join Stop the War. And one last thing, they've asked me that on the 24th of June at 6:30 p.m., there will be another event, a screening of the film Shadow World, introduced by Andrew Feinstein, the writer, Lindsay German, and the rapper Loki. So we will hopefully have many more of these events, as Jeremy said, even after we return to normality, because actually it's a very democratic way of having a discussion and involving people with it. And next time, I hope we have more time for discussions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tariq.
Tariq, can I say thank you to you? Thank you to Arundhati and everyone for joining. Let's do it again.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.